Good evening, everyone. Let me get my notes back up. We'll talk about some upcoming meetings that we've got. This coming Monday and every Monday at 5 o'clock, we have a phone bank for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We will be making calls this coming Monday, but if you're out for Yom Kippur, I'm also going to send out a link for a Tuesday phone bank that Downtown Independent Dems does every Tuesday. Same system, same idea. So if you can't make Monday night with us, maybe you can make Tuesday. If you have been able to come and you can bring a friend, please do. We're into the last few weeks of this campaign, and nobody's driving to Pennsylvania to knock on doors. So this is what we've got. This is what we need to do. So please join us on Mondays. You can go to grandstreetdems.nyc/Biden-Harris, and that'll bring you to the New York for Biden sign-up page. I sent out an email about it this weekend, but we've also got a bunch of meetings coming up related to our City Council District 1 race. That's an open seat. Margaret Chin is term limited out. We've got to pack a bunch of stuff in between now and February. Since petitioning starts in February, we need to have our endorsements all done by then. So that's why there's this focus right now on these 2021 races, even while we're obviously in the middle of a huge 2020 race. So next Wednesday at 7 p.m., we're going to have 3 of the candidates for District 1. That's Gigi Lee, Jenny Lamb Lowe, and Tiffany Winbush. And the following Wednesday, that's October 7th, also at 7 p.m., we're going to meet with Maud Marion, Chris Marte, and Denny Salas. Those are the 6 candidates right now for Council District 1. We are also going to have a big meeting, again with all 6 of them, on Sunday, November 15th. I know that's a ways out, but that's going to be the day we hear from all 6 candidates and vote on our endorsement for that race. So I really hope everybody can get that on their calendar. The reason we're having a couple of meetings is that this is a big race for us. This is our the main part of our of Grand Street Democrats Club is in District 1, and I want to make sure that we have multiple chances to hear from these candidates before we have to vote on an endorsement. We also have, in the middle of that, we've got our own October meeting on October 13th. That's a Tuesday. We're going to be electing new officers for the club, so if you are interested in that at all, please let me know. We're also going to hear from Mark Levine, who's running for borough president, and our last district attorney candidate, Tali Farhadian Weinstein, will join us on the 13th of October. A couple of other things. Grand Street Dems member Ellen Gruber-Garvey and Joyce Ravitz are partnering with a group called Vote Forward to write letters to voters in swing states and super states. Sent an email about this, I guess about a week and a half ago. But they are both available to help print letters out for you and lead you through the process of writing them and getting them in envelopes. This is a group that has worked in some swing states for the last couple of cycles. They've got a proven track record. Again, since nobody's able to take buses to Pennsylvania and knock on doors, we need to hit candidates from multiple angles. If they get a phone call, if they get a postcard, if they get a letter, each one of these things in sort of a different format reinforces the message that we need them to vote for Joe Biden. I will send an email out this evening, but Ellen and Joyce are available Thursday, tomorrow afternoon, from at 1 o'clock or at 5 o'clock, and Saturday afternoon at 1 o'clock. They can meet you in the Hillman Park, the one across the street from Fine Fair on Grand Street, in between the 530 block of Hillman and the 550 block of Hillman, between Columbia Street and Lewis Street. So you can do that outside. They can print some things out for you. Again, I'm going to send an email out about this evening, but Ellen's asked that you RSVP to her if you're interested at ellenggarvey@gmail.com. Some voter information, some voting information about what's coming up. We do now have a nearby early voting site that's going to be located in the school on the corner of Henry and Clinton Streets. That's going to start on October 24th. We would say that this is a safe way to vote. Everybody who did this in June said that the early voting sites were pretty empty. And there's plenty of time that whole week where you can go to a room that's not crowded. And you don't have to depend then on sending an absentee ballot and through the post office. So if you can vote in person and you can do that early, that's probably what we recommend you do. If you're going to request an absentee ballot, please do it right away. Please do it right away. You can go to nycabsentee.com. We're expecting absentee ballots to start getting sent out this week. But the earlier you can do that stuff, the better to make sure that you get the ballot. You can also drop off an absentee ballot at the early voting site. So sort of a hybrid way of doing that, but just be careful when you fill out your absentee ballot. You have to follow the instructions very carefully. They are not necessarily very clear. You need to seal the ballot in the envelope that's provided. You need to turn that over, sign and date it on the back. And if you're mailing it in, you're then putting that whole envelope into a second envelope to send in. If you drop the stuff off at your early voting site, again, you can bypass the post office. These absentee ballots will be brought back to BOE each night. They still won't get counted until after Election Day, but you'll know that they're being transported properly. Finally, Ben Yee and Chris Marte, two reps to the state committee, are going to be doing a little panel discussion on how to vote safely and be sure your vote gets counted. This is in conjunction with Village Reform Democrats on Tuesday, October 6th at 7 p.m. And again, please just look for an email from me. I'll have the RSVP link in there for that event. All right, so that's a bunch of things that are coming up, but it's now already 7:10 and I want to move on to our guests for the evening. We've got two more candidates for district attorney. And the first one up is Lucy Lang. Lucy, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and telling everybody a little bit about your candidacy, and then for everybody else, if you can do a raise hands or drop your name in the chat, we'll be able to do some Q&A with the candidates. So Lucy?
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and thanks to all the Grand Street Dems for inviting me here and for turning out tonight. I'm so pleased to see all of you. We all know that the city thrives when we're each treated with dignity, and as a criminal justice reform leader and a former assistant district attorney, I recognize that the role of the district attorney requires much more than prosecution, and that's really why I'm running, because it requires deep consideration of communities, it prioritizes prevention and rehabilitation. We are in a transformational moment in criminal justice, and so my campaign is focused on the three core values of dignity, equity, and safety. The crime survivors, their families, the incarcerated students I've worked with over the years, even my own young children, have really persuaded me that community-based solutions and restorative justice are vital to addressing trauma and preserving dignity in a way that can make our city healthy and safe, particularly now. So I'm running for district attorney to realize the full potential of what a district attorney can do. While it's true that many district attorneys and aspiring district attorneys talk about working with their community in dealing with issues of public safety, it isn't just something that I'm talking about, it's really something that I've done. So to that end, I want to talk a bit tonight about the work I started doing as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan, and then brought with me to the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, which I've spent the past several years running at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, working with prosecutors and communities across the country on some of these issues. As a young assistant district attorney, I received a letter, the office received a letter in response to violence in a public housing complex in Manhattan. It was a letter from anonymous members of the Tenants Association who were living in fear of violence and drug dealing that was preventing their children from going outside and from using the playgrounds and basketball courts. As a result, we began an investigation, and I oversaw a complicated murder and drug trafficking conspiracy case that enabled the tenants to finally reclaim the neighborhood for the families that lived there. But as the investigation concluded, I heard from the residents that the prosecution alone wouldn't solve their challenges. And so working with them and inspired by their request, I fought internally in the district attorney's office and then ultimately brought in other agencies to establish a first ever coalition of the local tenants association, NYCHA, the New York City Parks Department, and the NYPD to replant the courtyards, refurbish the buildings, and develop a gardening program that enabled the children and their families to safely regain use of their playgrounds and to fill the void that had been left by the conclusion of this investigation into the violence and drug dealing that had been plaguing the housing complex. So this was an idea that was met with internal resistance, and it was worth the fight to bring everyone on board, because once it was accomplished, it was one step further towards listening, hearing, and implementing what the community itself asked for in a way that combined traditional prosecutorial tools with non-traditional ones. As district attorney, I'll ensure that these sorts of community-focused responses are implemented throughout Manhattan and will be an advocate on behalf of local neighborhoods and communities. And I think it's really important to remember that currently and formerly incarcerated New Yorkers are also members of the community that the district attorney serves. Working to engage and rebuild trust with this group is a really core and critical part of the district attorney's job, especially now. And that's why, as an assistant district attorney, I conceived of and piloted and ultimately scaled a first of its kind college class that brought assistant district attorneys inside New York prisons to study criminal justice alongside incarcerated students. At the end of each semester, the incarcerated and prosecutor students together made reform proposals to a group of city leaders, including the district attorney, leaders from the mayor's office, the NYPD, and the Department of Corrections. While I ran the class over several years, approximately 80 ADAs, which is nearly 20% of the assistant district attorneys in Manhattan, voluntarily participated in this legal training course. As district attorney, I will require all assistant district attorneys to participate in the class to better understand the needs and perspectives of the incarcerated members of our community and to really understand what the consequences are of the incredibly important decisions that they make every day. These are just examples of the fact that public safety requires an understanding of what a community views as its own safety priorities. And to that end, I intend to spend my campaign and my tenure as district attorney listening and learning from the wide range of Manhattan communities and encouraging my staff to do the same. I will end the prohibition on assistant district attorneys serving on community boards and organizations, and instead encourage all staff to be fully engaged in their neighborhood and community groups. I'll incorporate community service of this nature into annual performance reviews. I will recruit and retain lawyers, social workers, and others who are mission aligned so that the 500 lawyers, hundreds of non-legal staff who comprise that office will be active and passionate participants in the implementation of the progress New Yorkers are calling for. I'm happy to pause if there are questions that folks have, or to continue and tell you more about what's on my mind as a candidate.
Well, let's try to take some questions. I'm sure that'll also give you a chance to say what's on your mind as a candidate. I mean, I'm always happy to go ahead with questions if nobody else has one, but please raise your hand to interrupt me as soon as you want. Lucy, you mentioned restorative justice, and I know you said a number of things there that I think are part of that process. But is there like a formal definition of restorative justice? Is there where does that fit in the context of what district attorneys are doing right now?
There's a tremendous amount of really inspiring scholarship around restorative justice practices, which find their root in the practices of indigenous cultures. And it takes a range of different forms. And I think that in being codified and ultimately scaled as part of the criminal justice system, whether it is pre-arrest, which is one place it could happen, or as part of the ultimate resolution in the case. It could take a number of different forms, and part of that, part of what I envision is having the flexibility to offer crime survivors, their families, and people who have committed a harm with the range of what might be possible through guided interventions that call upon the experts of restorative justice practitioners, who can include social workers, psychologists, cognitive behavioral therapists, and others with mental health expertise that frankly most lawyers simply lack. And that hasn't been a part of the practice of district attorney's offices, prosecution, and traditional responses to crime. So I'll give an example of an incredible restorative justice experience that I had the opportunity to witness just this past December. And the first time, as far as I can tell, in New York City history, restorative justice was used as part of a response to a homicide. This was a case that some of you may remember that was really devastating on the Upper West Side, where a beloved Baruch College professor was taking money out of an ATM, and a man who was down on his luck was waiting outside the vestibule and ultimately snatched the professor's money, pushed him, and the professor hit his head and died as a result of the injuries. So the man who was ultimately arrested and charged with felony murder had a very low IQ. He had no criminal record. He articulated remorse very early on in the process, and the incredibly compassionate family of the professor who had been killed articulated to the assistant DA assigned to the case deep concern for what a long period of incarceration could do to this man, and that was not necessarily what they wanted, although of course they wanted accountability for this tragedy in their family. And after a number of months of working with a professional, both the family and the man who had committed the murder were brought together in a facilitated circle in a private room, and they spent several hours talking together about the professor, about what had happened, about the man who was charged in his life and the things that had led him to that point. And that's one form of restorative justice. It is generally not designed with an intentional eye towards an apology or forgiveness, but that was part of what resulted in the one that I witnessed, that there was a true kind of reckoning and apology. And afterwards, both sets of people, the man who was charged and his sister who had joined him to support him, and the son of the professor and his wife who had a brand new baby who their father had never had a chance to meet, they all articulated satisfaction in this process in a way that I had never seen in the murder prosecutions that I handled that resulted in trials and often very long prison sentences. So I think that's another example of asking people what it is that justice looks like to them, what kind of responses to harm are going to provide a sense of repair and restoration to people. And so I envision creating a restorative justice unit within the office built into the trial division, such that there is a sort of a menu of options that assistant district attorneys can call upon depending on the facts of the cases before them, the needs of the people who are victimized, and the needs of the people who commit the harm.
And I'm sorry, is that process in lieu of criminal prosecution?
It can take all sorts of forms, and this is one of the things that I think is really promising about it. In Europe, it is used in all kinds of cases, sometimes in outright replacement for a punitive response. In a case that I just described, it was coupled with an 8-year prison sentence, which was less than half of what he would have received had he not decided to go through with the restorative practice. I think that I know that there are people in the restorative justice community who feel that it should be entirely separate from punishment. I think that where we are right now, it makes sense as part of a menu and perhaps integrated into another set of responses or combined with things. And there are also community court models where, in particular for low-level property crimes, where communities come together and use restorative circles with more than just 2 individuals, but actually with community members much more broadly, so that everyone understands the consequences of criminal conduct and that people come to kind of a collective resolution. And often in those cases, it's used entirely in place of a punitive response, or it may be coupled with something like community service that is intentionally tailored to respond to the harm. I think it's particularly promising in the area of hate crimes, which we've seen really a tragic increase in during the pandemic. And in cases that are often motivated, in which hate is motivated by lack of education and exposure, restorative justice may have some real potential to help change people's understanding of things. Actually, the neuroscience really bears out that it has a more long-term effect in changing someone's behavior than punishment alone.
All right, thanks for explaining that. Keen, you've got your hand up?
Right. Am I muted? No.
No, you're on.
Okay. It sounds just great, Lucy, but now I'm worried about if you're the head of that and trying to convince all those people to agree and go ahead, because you can't do it by yourself. And you mentioned that your idea about the public housing playground, you worked with a lot of people, but there was pushback and they weren't, so there was resistance. And, you know, how do you deal with that? I mean, please convince me that you can actually transform the whole organization, which seems dubious to me.
Keen, I'm so happy that you asked, because it's an area that I'm really passionate about, having watched district attorneys around the country try to operationalize reform. And we could have a whole referendum on who's been successful and who hasn't been, and in which ways. But the reality is that folks who have deep experience in the system tend to be the people who are most effective at implementing real change. Part of it is persuading people to come along internally. Part of it is having the kind of temperament that can withstand pushback. And I think that a big part of it is also a kind of changing of the public's demands on an institution. And there's no doubt that what the public wants from the district attorney now, at least as it's articulated in a mainstream way, is very different than when I started at the district attorney's office in 2006. I think the public's understanding has changed. And I will tell you that I think that people who aspire to become prosecutors have changed. And I think that people who became prosecutors with one mindset, many of them have changed as well. And I believe in my core that, and this is part of what really motivates me towards the idea of dignity as being what is so critical and missing from the criminal justice system. I really believe in people's capacity to grow and change, and the criminal justice system doesn't allow for that. But I think we need to figure out ways to foster it within people who are charged. And I think we have to allow for the fact that it can happen in institutions too, but it requires expert leadership with real experience and with an articulable vision to enable people to come along. The DA's office is not alone in that it is a place that is hard to change. Organizational cultures are tough, but there is no doubt in my mind that it is totally possible. And I think a big part of it is exposing people to what the public is calling for. I started one of my, I'm kind of a book club junkie, and I started a book club in the DA's office shortly after the first serial aired, because there were so many folks in the DA's office who were talking about it, who had opinions. There were young lawyers who didn't know what to think. There were older lawyers who were extremely experienced. And it seemed like a great opportunity for us to draw upon the expertise of folks in the office. And so monthly, the book club met, and we read everything from Locking Up Our Own to the new Jim Crow, not because everyone in the book club agreed, but precisely because they didn't. And as sort of silly as that sounds as a policy idea, I do think that exposure to what's happening in the broader world, especially as it relates to the work of a bureaucracy, is critically important. So one key tenet would be about bringing in ideas and discussions from the outside. When I was running the Manhattan DA Academy, which is the sort of in-house think tank, I brought to the office Adam Foss, who's a terrific thinker on these issues, who is working on cultural, we brought him in to deal with cultural humility, the practice of better understanding diverse cultures, to do a set of trainings And we brought in neuroscientists to talk about juvenile brain development. And the science around that has changed tremendously just in the past 15 years. So who's to blame assistant DAs that they didn't have a handle on it when they started a long time ago? And I think that it's incumbent upon the leadership to, I don't want to say educate people because I don't mean it in a didactic sense, but I mean, open people up to conversation, share ideas, bring in alternative viewpoints. And the best possible way to do that I have discovered is through the kind of liberal arts college model that I used in building out the college and prison class that I described.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's do one more question. Marion, you've got your hand up, please.
Is there anyone before me? I'm happy to wait. Okay. So Lucy, we talked about this a little bit, and I think you know I'm very interested in restorative justice. And I also am so concerned about disproportionality based on race, ethnicity, and class, and immigration status. And I think cultural humility is really important, and it's really a good beginning. I don't see any criminal legal systems yet that are equalizing, that are creating equity around, I'm going to say race and class to begin with. Those are not the only things. So what do you think will be necessary if you were trying to implement, trying to get, is it 80 or 100 assistant DAs? It's a lot.
500.
Oh, all right. I knew it was a lot.
It's even
So
harder.
how are you gonna, I mean, how are you going to approach these issues of racial equity with them so that they're not just applying restorative justice with, you know, white middle class people or white collar crime, or that it really becomes something across the board? Big question, I'm sorry.
Well, Marianne, I think that the big question has a big answer, and I think of it in two different buckets. And the one is the cultural, and the other is a sort of more practical. So the cultural piece, I think that part of it is aligned with kind of what I was just describing about building a mission-aligned workforce. And that I think is really key. And a big part of that is also about the kind of culture that the district attorney helps establish in terms of relationship with the police department and other relevant agencies. So there's that piece. The other piece, and this is kind of a boring answer, but I think it's honestly true. The other piece is data. And offices who I partnered with the Vera Institute starting the summer before last in a racial justice and prosecution project. And this is kind of an ongoing and an iterative process, but we started by bringing a bunch of prosecutors and community members down to the Equal Justice Initiative Museum and Memorial in Montgomery in order to sort of root our sense of the imperative of the work in the history of oppression in this country and racial injustice, and of course, how the evolution of the locally elected prosecutor is directly linked to the legacy of slavery and racism in the country. So we started the work there, and ultimately kind of came to the view as a collective that one way to go about addressing these issues was by encouraging all DA's offices, and the Manhattan DA's office is in some ways ahead of the curve on this nationally, to aggregate their data and to develop a way of interfacing demographic data with case level data, which in many places wasn't happening and only started happening in Manhattan, I don't know, 8 years ago or thereabouts. And so the first step is understanding what the racial disparity, what the race is of people in cases who are coming in, beyond just saying, I can look in a courtroom and see that there's racism baked into this. And then assessing at what stage of the process are racial disparities happening, and then creating affirmative policy interventions to change them. So that may mean the observation that marijuana offenses, for example, are racially evidence racial disparities, and as a result, just making the decision to not prosecute marijuana at all because it's simply not worth it because of the extent to which it's racially unjust. And there are there are a number of other areas where you could identify those racial disparities once you've aggregated the data. So something like something that we did observe a number of years ago, whether or not a case is indicted, cases of the same type in which the person charged was a person of color as compared to a white person, were more likely to be indicted, just of particular types of cases. And once you identify that, then you can apply a different kind of scrutiny to those set of cases. One, you can try to figure out where the issues are coming in. Is it happening at the level of the person who writes the case up? Is it happening at the level of the supervisor who makes the decision about whether or not the case is presented to the grand jury? Or is it happening amongst the grand jury? I mean, these are all things that you can't sort of identify without data. And I think that making policy that is not rooted in an understanding of the nexus of the problem is one of the biggest challenges that the city faces. So what we don't want is a district attorney who diagnoses the end result of the problem and makes sweeping changes without a deep understanding of how the system works. So I think that while you may not hear much in the way of policy difference between me and some of my opponents, I'm the one with the experience in the office and in the reform world who has the expertise to get this done, and a commitment to addressing racial and socioeconomic injustice is the absolute top priority.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. I'm sorry that's all the time we've got with you this evening. But thanks so much for joining us. And I'll be sending you some information about the forum that we hope to put together in December. So I hope we see you again. We see you again then. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. And I will drop it in the chat, but there are more about my platforms and plans at votelucylang.com. And I would love for you all to follow me on social media at LucyLangNYC. Thanks for including me tonight.
Okay, thanks very much. So now we've got our second guest, another candidate for district attorney. Liz Crotty is with us. And Liz, I think we'll do the same thing. If you want to take a few minutes to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your candidacy, and then we'll have some time to take a few questions also for you.
Sure. Hello, everyone. How you doing? I'm Liz. Hi to Lucy. We've known each other before. You did a nice job. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Liz Crotty. I'm born and raised in New York City. Born and raised actually down by you guys in Stuyvesant Town. Born, raised, educated. I went to Fordham Law School, and then 20 years ago this month was the anniversary of me walking into 100 Center Street in the DA's office for the first time. I walked in as, a new graduate from law school, very happy to be there, to be a public servant, with the hope that I was going to change people's lives and help people. And as my boss at the time, Mr. Morgenthau, said, to do the right thing. I then went and I did that job, and I did it for 6 years. I prosecuted street crime. I went to the investigative division. Then after 2 years, I went to a firm. After 6 years, I went to a firm, 2 years at the firm. And then 12 years ago, I started my own law practice. I've been a criminal defense attorney for the past 12 years. I've represented more people than I ever prosecuted. And I have developed over the past 20 years as a 20-year practitioner. I have the experience, perspective, and discretion to really come into the office and make meaningful changes that make sense. I think that at the end of the day, the job of the district attorney is that victims need to get justice, defendants need to get a fair shot, and everyone needs to feel safe and secure. I think that the way we do this is very complicated. I think not so complicated too, in the sense that every case is different. Every case has its own fact pattern, every case has its own facts, and every person who's involved in the case is different. Criminal cases are kind of like snowflakes. There's no two that are alike. And I think that you have to look at all cases through the prism of what is the case about and what is happening. I think that when you look at that, there's a couple different things that can happen where you can really make meaningful changes. I, with all my other people who I'm running with, I'm not for criminalizing poverty, addiction, mental health issues, but there's a lot more that the district attorney's office does. I mean, the district attorney, the textbook definition is the district attorney prosecutes crime and investigates crime. And it's within their discretion to do both of those things. I think one thing that gets really lost in all of these topics and forums is what the district attorney investigates. New York City is and Manhattan is the financial capital of the world. There is a lot of white collar crime that happens here. There are banks, corporations, companies, public officials who all come under the purveyance of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. I think a lot has to be concentrated to those areas. I think that we have to create a system where everyone it gets looked at, and that we can prosecute crimes across the board. Reform gets a lot, and you have to reform the system, and you have to make it so that everyone gets a fair shake. I think you have to make it so everyone has a fair and equal opportunity and the outcomes are equal, no matter who you are or what you've been representing. But I think that there's different ways to do that. I think you can definitely do that. I think there's a lot to be said for first-time offenders and how to deal with them and giving everyone a shot to not go to jail. I also know, as being a defense attorney, actions, have consequences, not incarceration. And I think you have to have some sort of consequence. And I think that sometimes looking at the case and seeing where you can intervene and do better. I think there's another thing that we all have to talk about is the police and how you work with the police. The job is to work with the police. That's part and parcel of what the job is. And I think if you look at it, you can come to a holistic way of prosecuting cases. Why me? Because this is what I've been doing for 20 years. I walked into the building 20 years ago and I basically haven't left. I'm the only one in the race who's represented both sides of the courtroom. I understand what victims feel, and I understand what defendants feel. I understand what they're going through, and I understand that they want to put this behind them. I think the matrix, New York City has always been known as the skyline. It's the most emblematic thing about Manhattan, is its skyline. And it used to be the tallest building was the greatest building, like the World Trade Center when it was there, and the Empire State Building. Those were great buildings because they were the highest buildings. And now, buildings in New York City have changed. The matrix is, what is the green footprint? What is their carbon emission? What is the output they're putting into the environment? And I think that same matrix can be applied to criminal cases. I think we've all learned that just putting people in jail for long terms doesn't work. But at the same time, and you want to give people a chance, but at the same time, sometimes there are cases that do need to be prosecuted. And I think that based on my experience and perspective and the discretion to know the difference is what makes me the best one for the job. So, do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I'll start off again, but I encourage everybody else to raise their hand, and I'll get you into this discussion. Can you tell me, first of all, just a little bit more about your resume? Is there with the work you've been doing for the last 12 years as a criminal defense attorney, is there any particular specialty there? Do you?
I do everything, soup to nuts, summonses to felonies, state cases, federal cases. If you've been arrested or you've gotten a ticket, I've done the case. I also do some pro bono work. I work in the Elizabeth Detention Center pre-corona. I get people ready for their credible fear interviews, when you come and are requesting asylum, you have to pass a credible fear interview before you can even get in front of a judge for an immigration. So I get people ready. It's a niche practice of getting people ready for their government interview, but it seemed to have developed it quite well. I also serve on the pro bono council of the Southern District, and I do some pro bono work there. But generally, I do all different kinds of street crime, white collar crime, you name it, I've done it.
I'm going to keep asking questions until I see hands up.
Okay.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation if other people want to jump in. You did mention you mentioned working with the police, and we didn't get to kind of get at this directly with Lucy, although I think a lot of the stuff she was talking about is all related. But if you would say, if you could, first of all, what you were feeling this summer as the city and the nation was going through some turmoil about police behavior in the streets. What in that behavior would you like to see changed, and how would you be able to use the power of the district attorney to actually make changes in NYPD?
Well, I first think that there's a national standard and there's a New York City standard. So when it comes to a national standard, yes, I think the senseless killing of people for $20 bills, loose cigarettes, no-knock warrants. I mean, I think all of that is horrible, and I don't think that it's really indefensible. And I don't think that police officers are above the law. If you commit a crime, whatever it may be, then you should be prosecuted for it. I think in that national, I think that there is a public outcry that is very much pertinent to all of this. I think too, when you go to a Black Lives Matter rally, which I did, and like silence equals compliance. I think everyone has an obligation almost to go to these rallies so that you can finally say, like, listen, I am acknowledging that this is a problem. And listen, also as a 20-year career practitioner in criminal justice, you can't sit and say with a straight face that it's not racially, socially, economically biased. You can't. That is just a fact. The difference is how do you change that fact? And I think you don't change it overnight. And I think it's on a case-by-case basis. I think in every case, you've got to really give people a chance to do better and victims allowed to be heard. I think on people with first arrests, they should be given chances to not go to jail. They should be given chances up until, it depends on what it is. If you do a triple homicide, I'm not going to say, oh, you shouldn't go to jail. But I think, in the regular mill of the case, I don't think jail is always the answer. And I think you should prosecute the case to a point, but it can still result in a non-criminal disposition, which helps the person move forward. The collateral consequences of a criminal record are huge. If judgment is entered on a surcharge, it renders them not be able to get a loan. There's immigration consequences that are big, and there are orders of protection. I mean, there's so many different things that happen in each and every other case that has nothing to do almost with whether you're guilty or innocent. The collateral consequences are huge, and I think that all needs to be taken into consideration. I also think with police, the system was built where police are meant to help, and the police build up cases. That's what they do. They are the ones who make the arrest, and then they refer the case to the district attorney's office, and then the district attorney's office decides how to process that case. There has to be a working dialogue with the police. There has to be community involvement. I think community involvement is key. I think that working with police is key. I do think the police and NYPD need to be better trained. I don't think 6 months is a long enough training period. I think training needs to be ongoing. And I think that there are things that need to be changed about the culture of policing. But I think vilifying the police doesn't help us get to where we need to go in New York.
Is there something from within the DA's office that you would employ to help make some of these changes with the police?
Yes, I think you have to have community bureaus and community liaisons where people who are in the DA's office work with people in specific precincts. I also think that now data is our friend, and I think you can get a lot of data. So you can get what the output numbers and the number of arrests from police, different precincts in New York, and you can see how many arrests are made. You can see which officers are making those arrests. You can see which officers you have to process the case or you have to decline to prosecute the case because there's something inherently wrong with that case. And then there's something that you can go back and call the CO of the command at the precinct and say, hey, what's going on with this officer? I mean, I think that these are part and parcel of getting to the point where people can work together. I think too, the other problem is that if people are not performing, DAs and police officers alike, it can't be afraid to be like, that's not the right job for you. I mean, there's no job attenuation in the police department and prosecutors. I mean, if you're not doing your job correctly, then I think, you know, you have to be dealt with accordingly as well.
Okay, thanks. Keen, I see your hand up. Can you unmute and go ahead?
So I'm a little bit worried. You talk a lot about the individual cases, and I wonder if you understand the systemic things that have to happen and what they are. So what would you do systemically? You know, each case is differently, but it's not just we have some bad apples in the barrel. I think the barrel is somehow wrong sometimes. I don't know.
No, I think there are systemic problems with the case. I think that that's always going to be a problem when you deal with bureaucratic agencies. I think one of the ways that we deal with the systemic problems is that you have programs such as something that a policy where I want to start, where you have on a first arrest up to a D felony. If it is a first arrest and you have meaning you have no criminal record, then you have a way of working off that criminal case so that it results in a non-criminal disposition. That doesn't mean that we don't prosecute it. That doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to it. It says we give people the chance to work off their cases. I think the matrix for what you have to measure the district attorney's office from is, and it's not a first year matrix and it's not a second year matrix, but you have to cut recidivism. Recidivism is cutting recidivism and not having people coming back through the criminal justice system is going to be the benchmark of how the system improves. And I think if you deal with those kinds of things, then you will deal with the systemic racism. And it's not just racist, it's very socioeconomic as well. And so I think too, at the other end of the spectrum, when you have a movement like Black Lives Matter, at the heart of Black Lives Matter is the fact that Black and brown people have not had the same access to education, housing, healthcare, and opportunity. If we work together as a group to give Black and brown communities those things, the criminal justice system will naturally be lessened in the Black and brown community because there will be things to make up for those things. So I think that I am very cognizant of the systemicness to it, as I've been a defense attorney for 12 years. So I see it, and I've represented people of all races, religions, colors, creeds across the board. So I understand it quite well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bill, you want to unmute and go ahead?
Hi, thanks for making it here tonight. I sort of agree with you that there needs to be sort of work with the police, but I do believe that they need to accept the community input, which I found even our own precinct, even though the meetings tend to be very amiable, they sort of slough off most of the community concerns. How do you, in terms of being a candidate, would you accept campaign funds from either of the police associations, the PBA or the sergeants? I can't call them unions because they're not. They're like protection rackets mostly. But
no, I wouldn't, because I don't want to have the appearance of impropriety. But however, where I think I differ from some of the other candidates, I would accept their endorsement, because I think the fact of the matter is that you have to work with the police. So if they think I'm the best person to work with, then I will take that, but I will not take their money. You do have to maintain a level of independence, but I think in maintaining the level of independence doesn't mean I don't want to work with you. So, but I would not take their money.
Thank you.
In lieu of other hands, I'm going to continue to ask some questions, I guess. You mentioned that Manhattan is the center of the financial universe. There are banks and a lot of white-collar crimes here. I feel like one of the knocks on fair or unfair, but one of the knocks on the legacy of Cy Vance is that it seems as though powerful people have been able to avoid the full force of the law based on what? Based on based on connections? Is it campaign donations? I'm not sure, but what is the way in which the DA's office needs to adequately prosecute those crimes and make sure? How does the DA make sure that she maintains an image of being independent?
Well, I think that just comes from within. I mean, I think when I was at the district attorney's office, I worked in the investigative division, and I worked on a long-term international case. Mr. Morgenthau used to think that jurisdiction was created because the Fed is in New York City, and every dollar that gets transferred around the world in any kind of money transfer goes through the Fed in Lower Manhattan. So that's how he established jurisdiction in all of these white collar crime cases. And that's where he went. I don't think that Cy's office has really, minus the Trump subpoena, they haven't had a lot of big white collar notable investigations. That doesn't mean that there haven't been any, but I just think that you have to really go after that and look after that. And I think that there's a lot of different things that have happened, especially with coronavirus and the amounts of money and aid that's been handed out. I think that all these things should be looked at and how they're doing. And, I think that there's different things that have happened under the de Blasio administration that should be looked at. I'm not saying there's a crime. I don't know the evidence. So I always like to see what you have in front of you. But there are a lot of potentials out there that haven't been investigated, or to my knowledge, you never really know if you're being investigated. But I think that those are the interesting things that you can look at. And I think if you have to be able to prosecute cases, as Mr. Morgenthau used to say, I keep quoting him, without fear or favor. And you have to come at it from an independent point of view. And I have no problems putting that forward in my candidacy and who I am and what I stand for.
It's still a position that lives within a world of New York politics, though. So is there a way to ensure that you and your office would be that there wouldn't be a conflict of interest, that you would be immune from that sort of influence?
Well, yeah, I think that's why you run. Like it's gonna, as you guys mentioned in the beginning of this meeting, that it's going to be a big year and lots of elections. I'm not going to be on a ticket with a mayoral candidate, because that mayor is going to be the mayor while I'm hopefully the district attorney. I mean, no one is immune from that. You have to really keep your objectivity and keep your independence. And that's all you can say. And you just have to take that on face value as a voter of who you think that's going to be. People say a lot of things, but what are you going to do? And I know that having been on both sides of the courtroom and having investigated cases and having been a defense attorney, and, listen, if you can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, I think then it doesn't matter who they are or what they stand for. It's like, if you have a case that you can prove, then you have an obligation, and that is against the law and that is properly investigated, then you have an obligation to go forward, and it doesn't matter who the subject of that investigation is. I mean, as being a defense attorney with the federal government, against the federal government, sometimes I think with the feds and the Southern District and the Eastern District, sometimes I want to get t-shirts. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. I mean, so I understand prosecutorial discretion, but also there is maintaining independence. And if you can prove the case, it doesn't matter who's it's against.
Marion, you want to ask our last question here?
All right, it's kind of a quickie. It sounds to me, Liz, that you don't believe that there's structural racism, and that by being able to deal with everybody individually, somehow we bypass that. And so the numbers don't bear that out. Like the reality of who gets prosecuted and who gets, imprisoned don't bear that out. So it kind of worries me till you say, well, you just take each case individually and you don't really worry about that. Am I not hearing you right?
I don't think you are, because I've been a defense attorney for 12 years. So I understand more than most about structural racism. But at the same time, and you have to deal with it. But at the same time, there's not a policy that says, oh, you know, there's not a policy or a way beyond looking at every case individually and what those facts are, what that person is, and what happened, that you can go for each case. I mean, you can't say, I'm not going to prosecute a percentage of crime just because of the ethnicity of the person who committed that crime. So it's not that I don't understand it. It's that I'm looking at what the crime is and what happened. And I'm leaving it as very fact-based. So I understand, and you do have to work against that. And I think that that's what works against it. What works for it is trying to keep people out of the criminal justice system. And that's where you don't criminalize poverty or addiction or mental illness. And you don't, you decriminalize sex work. And you look at those things. But when all those things are looked at, you have to look at what's left. And I think that that's why I will go back to each and every case is different, because I think that that's the matrix rather than what the policy is or what an empirical number is, because that's not what drives each and every case. But I do understand it. We might not agree on how to deal with it, but I do understand it.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, I think I'm sorry these things have to be so short. I really could talk about these issues all night long, but we're out of time for tonight. Liz, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to coming back in December. My website is Liz Crotty 2021. And I look forward, I'll put it in the chat, but thanks so much for having me. And this was really interesting discussion.
Yeah. And thanks for everybody else for showing up tonight. As I said, we've got a bunch of other meetings coming up, some city council races we need to look at over the next couple of weeks. Normally we stick around in this meeting to chat a little bit, but I have to say I actually see a lot of names here tonight that I don't recognize. And so I'm a little nervous about having our normal coffee chat after talking to the candidates. So let's postpone that. We'll have another chance just within Grand Street Dems to talk about the candidates later on this month. So thanks everybody. Have a great night.
Great. Thank
Nice
you.
to see those of you who put your cameras on. Thank you, Bill.
Good night.
you.
Thanks,
Good
Grand
night,
Street.
all.
Thanks, Lucy.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Liz.
Jeremy,